The Nebula Drift was not the prettiest bar in the galaxy, but it was honest. And that was enough for most travelers who passed through. Waystation Sigma 7 Danny Kowalski stood behind the long counter made of salvaged ship panels, wiping down glasses with a worn cloth while soft music played from speakers that crackled every few minutes. He did not mind the imperfections because they gave the place character. And character was something the cold emptiness of space often lacked. The bar was busy tonight, filled with creatures from dozens of worlds who had come seeking drink, company, or simply a place to rest before continuing their journeys across the stars. A group of Grothians, massive beings with thick gray skin and 4 arms, laughed loudly in the corner while playing a card game none of the other species understood. Near the window, 2 Cellari pilots with their feathered crests and sharp eyes discussed trade routes in hushed voices. And scattered throughout the room were merchants, miners, drifters, and wanderers of every shape and size. Danny watched them all with the calm patience of a man who had seen much in his 46 years of life. He had been many things before becoming a bartender, and those experiences had taught him to read a room better than most could read a book in a corner booth near the back. A young human woman sat alone with a datapad in front of her. Her name was Lisa Hartley, and she was an engineer passing through the station on her way to a job in the outer colonies. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she had been traveling for too long without proper rest. Lisa looked up from her schematics and caught Danny's eye. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, one human to another in a sea of alien faces. She nodded back and returned to her work, grateful for the quiet moment in an otherwise chaotic journey near the bar. A small creature called Ven sat hunched over a drink he had barely touched. Ven was a Talori, a species known for their large eyes, soft fur, and nervous dispositions. They were merchants by nature, traders who survived through cleverness rather than strength. Tonight, however, Ven looked more frightened than usual, his small hands trembling as he glanced toward the door every few seconds. Danny noticed the Talori's fear, but said nothing. Customers came to the Nebula Drift to escape their problems, not to share them with strangers. If Ven wanted to talk, he would talk, and if not, Danny would respect his silence. The minutes passed peacefully, and Danny began to think it would be a good night. The Grothians were happy, the Cellari were quiet, and nobody seemed interested in starting trouble. He allowed himself a small smile as he poured a drink for a regular customer, a 6-legged creature whose name he could never pronounce correctly. Then the door slammed open with a sound like thunder, and everything changed. The creature that stepped into the Nebula Drift was unlike anything most of the patrons had ever seen up close, and those who recognized it immediately wished they had not. It stood 7 feet tall with a body covered in natural bone armor that gleamed under the bar's dim lights. Its face was a nightmare of sharp angles and predator eyes that glowed faint orange in the shadows. Massive claws tipped each of its 4 fingers, and when it breathed, the sound was like wind passing through a cave full of bones. This was a Vorshan, and Vorshans were known across the galaxy for one thing above all else. They hunted sentient beings for sport. The entire bar went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Drinks were set down with shaking hands, and every creature in the room seemed to shrink back toward the walls. Even the confident Grothians had stopped their card game and watched with wide eyes. Danny set down his cloth and studied the newcomer with a calm expression that did not match the tension filling the room. He had heard stories about Vorshans, terrible stories about colonies raided and travelers who vanished without a trace. He had never met one in person, but he had learned long ago that fear was a luxury he could not afford. The Vorshan, whose name was Krikstal, scanned the room slowly, his orange eyes moving from face to face with predatory interest. He sniffed the air deeply, and a low rumble of satisfaction rose from his chest when he found what he was looking for. Ven. Dvorshan growled, his voice like stones grinding together. "I have found you at last." The small Tollery let out a whimper of pure terror and tried to make himself even smaller in his seat. His large eyes filled with tears as he looked around desperately for help, but no one would meet his gaze. Every other patron in the bar suddenly found something fascinating to look at on the floor or the ceiling or anywhere, except that the terrified merchant still stepped forward, each footfall heavy enough to shake the glasses on nearby tables. He bared his teeth in something that might have been a smile but looked more like a promise of violence. "You owe a debt," Dvorshan declared loudly enough for everyone to hear, "and I have come to collect. You will come with me now, or I will take you in pieces. The choice is yours, little prey." Ven began to cry softly, his whole body shaking as he realized that no one in this room full of beings would lift a finger to save him. He was alone, and he was going to die. Lisa Hartley watched from her booth with horror and anger mixing in her chest. She wanted to help, but what could she do against a creature like that? She was an engineer, not a soldier. The other patrons felt the same helpless shame. They outnumbered Dvorshan, but none of them were fighters, and Dvorshans were legendary for their brutality. To challenge one was to invite death. Then Danny Kowalski did something that made every creature in the bar question his sanity. He stepped out from behind the counter, still holding his half-finished beer, and walked directly toward the massive predator. Dvorshan turned to face this unexpected interruption, amusement flickering in his terrible eyes. Here was a human, one of those soft and squishy beings from a distant world called Earth. Crickstel had heard of humans, but had never considered them worthy of attention. They were not hunters, not warriors, just another weak species stumbling through a galaxy full of dangers they could not comprehend. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Danny said in a voice as calm as still water, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We do not allow hunting inside this establishment." The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the room stared at the human with expressions ranging from disbelief to pity. This foolish bartender had just signed his own death warrant. Crickstil threw back his head and laughed, a horrible sound that echoed off the walls and made several patrons flinch. "You," Dvorshan said when his laughter finally stopped. "You dare to challenge me, little human?" Danny shrugged and took a sip of his beer. "I dare to ask politely," he replied, "and I suggest you take the opportunity while it still exists." Dvorshan's eyes narrowed, and his amusement began to curdle into anger. No prey had ever spoken to him this way, and he did not like it at all. Danny turned to Lisa, who had risen from her booth without quite knowing why. He walked over and placed his beer in her hands. "Hold my beer," he said simply. Lisa blinked in confusion, but something in the human's eyes made her grip the glass tightly and step back behind them. Crickstal let out a roar that shook the room and lunged toward the helpless Tollery, and that was when Danny Kowalski showed everyone why humans should never be underestimated. Danny moved faster than anyone expected a human could move. One moment he was standing still, and the next he had grabbed a heavy metal bar stool and swung it directly into the side of Crickstal's skull with a sound like a bell being struck by a hammer. Dvorshan staggered sideways, his charge toward Ven interrupted by an impact he had not anticipated. Orange eyes blinked in confusion as the massive predator tried to understand what had just happened. No prey had ever struck him before, and the sensation was so foreign that his mind struggled to process it. The bar erupted in gasps and startled cries. A Grothian knocked over the card table in shock, and two Solari pilots nearly fell out of their chairs. Lisa Hartley stood frozen with Danny's beer still clutched in her hands, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Danny did not pause to enjoy the reaction. He stepped between the stunned Dvorshan and the terrified Tollery, placing himself directly in the path of danger. His body was relaxed but ready, and his eyes never left the predator in front of him. "I told you to leave," Danny said quietly, "and I meant it. Crickstall shook his massive head and focused on the human with new interest. Blood trickled from a small cut on his temple, where the bone armor had cracked slightly, and rage began to build behind his glowing eyes. "You struck me," the Vortian growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You actually struck me, little human. Do you have any idea what I am going to do to you now?" Danny nodded calmly. "You are going to try to kill me," he replied. "And you are going to fail." The confidence in the human's voice was so absolute that several patrons wondered if they were witnessing a death wish or something else entirely. No sane being would speak to a Vortian this way, unless they had a very good reason. Crickstall let out another roar and lunged at Danny with claws extended and jaws open wide. The attack was blindingly fast, faster than most species could follow, and it should have ended with the human torn to shreds on the bar floor. But Danny was not there when the claws arrived. He had sidestepped at the last possible moment, using a technique that came from years of training and countless life or death situations. His body flowed like water around the Vortian's attack, and as Crickstall stumbled past, Danny delivered a powerful kick to the back of the predator's knee. The joint buckled, and 7 feet of armored hunter crashed into a table full of drinks. Glass shattered, liquid sprayed across the floor, and Crickstall found himself on one knee for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Who are you?" the Vortian demanded as he rose to his feet, now treating the human as a genuine threat rather than helpless prey. Danny picked up another bar stool and held it ready. "My name is Danny Kowalski," he said, "and for 15 years I served as a combat rescue specialist in the frontier colonies. My job was to go into the worst places in the galaxy and bring people home alive. I have fought pirates, raiders, and creatures that would make even you think twice. I retired because I was tired of violence, not because I had forgotten how to use it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly the soft human bartender did not look soft at all. He looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a survivor of battles that would have killed most beings 10 times over. Lisa felt her heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. She had read about humans like Danny in history files, men and women who had tamed the wild edges of human space through courage and sacrifice. She had never expected to meet one in a place like this. Then the Talori peeked out from behind his booth, his large eyes fixed on the human who had chosen to defend him. Tears still streamed down his furry face, but now they were mixed with something that might have been hope. Crickstall studied Danny with new caution. The human's stance, his balance, the way he held the improvised weapon, all of it spoke of real experience and genuine skill. This was not going to be the easy hunt the Vortian had anticipated. "You are brave," Crickstall admitted grudgingly, "but bravery will not save you. I have killed hundreds of beings stronger and faster than any human. Your courage only means you will die tired instead of quickly." Danny shrugged. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you have never fought someone who actually knows how to hurt you. Your species relies on fear and intimidation. You are used to prey that runs or freezes. You have probably never faced an opponent who wanted to fight back." The truth of those words struck Crickstall harder than the barstool had. The human was right. Vortian hunts were rarely actual battles because their prey was always too terrified to resist effectively. This situation was completely outside his experience. Before the Vortian could respond, a crash came from the back of the bar. A second set of armored feet pounded against the floor as another Vortian burst through the kitchen entrance. This new predator was slightly smaller than Crickstall, but just as deadly. His name was Brex, and he served as Crickstall's hunting partner. Together they had taken down prey on a dozen worlds, and together they had never failed. "Brother," Brex growled as he assessed the situation, "why is the human still alive?" "He's more dangerous than he appears," Crickstall replied without taking his eyes off Danny. "But it does not matter. There are 2 of us now. Danny's expression did not change, but Lisa could see the slight tension in his shoulders. Fighting one Vortian was insane, and fighting two was probably impossible. Even a trained human could only do so much against such overwhelming odds. Then Lisa made a decision that surprised even herself. She set Danny's beer down carefully on the nearest table and grabbed the fire suppression canister mounted on the wall beside her. It was heavy and awkward, but it would have to do. "Hey, ugly," she shouted at Brex. "Over here." The second Vortian turned toward her with hunger in his eyes, delighted to find softer prey presenting itself. He lunged toward her with claws ready to tear and jaws ready to bite. Lisa waited until he was almost upon her and then triggered the canister directly into his face. Thick white chemical foam erupted in a powerful stream, filling Brex's eyes and nose and mouth with blinding, choking substance. The Vortian screamed and clawed at his face, stumbling backward into a support pillar with a crash that shook the entire bar. He was not seriously injured, but he could not see, and for the moment that was enough. Danny allowed himself a brief smile of appreciation. The young engineer had good instincts and even better courage. "Nice work," he called to Lisa. "Now stay back and let me handle the rest." Crystal roared with fury at seeing his partner incapacitated so easily. These humans were proving far more troublesome than any prey had a right to be. Vortian leader threw himself at Danny with renewed savagery, determined to end this humiliation once and for all. Claws slashed through the air in deadly patterns, each strike aimed at vital points that would kill or cripple. With a single blow, Danny blocked, dodged, and deflected with everything he had. The bar stool shattered against Cricksteel's armored forearm, and Danny had to dive over the bar counter to avoid a strike that would have taken his head off. Bottles crashed and glass flew as the fight destroyed everything in its path. The other patrons pressed themselves against the walls, watching in terrified fascination as a single human held his ground against one of the galaxy's most feared predators. And somewhere in the chaos, a small Tallery merchant began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might actually survive this night. The fight between Danny Kowalski and Crickstal was unlike anything the patrons of the Nebula Drift had ever witnessed. It was brutal, desperate, and utterly mesmerizing in its intensity. Danny used every trick he had learned in 15 years of frontier combat. He threw bottles at the Vortian's eyes, kicked chairs into his path, and used the cramped space of the bar to prevent the predator from using his superior size effectively. Whenever Cricksteel tried to corner him, Danny found another angle of escape. Whenever the Vortian lunged, Danny was already moving somewhere else, but Cricksteel was learning too. He was a hunter who had survived countless battles, and he adapted quickly to his opponent's tactics. Each exchange brought him a little closer to landing a killing blow, and Danny could feel the margin for error shrinking with every second behind the bar. Brex had finally cleared enough foam from his eyes to see again. The second Vortian shook his head and let out a howl of rage that promised terrible vengeance. He spotted Lisa trying to edge toward the main door and began stalking toward her with murder in his gaze. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest as she realized the fire suppression trick would not work twice. Brex was angry and alert now, and he would not fall for the same attack again. She looked around desperately for another weapon, another option, anything that might give her a chance to survive. Then a massive gray hand landed on Brex's shoulder from behind. The Vortian spun to find himself face to face with Torgan, the largest of the Grothians who had been playing cards earlier. Torgan stood nearly as tall as the predator, and his forearms were thick with muscle built from decades of heavy labor in asteroid mines. "You want the human," Torgan rumbled in a voice like distant thunder. "You go through me first." Brex snarled and slashed at the Grothian, but Torgan caught the clawed arm with two of his own hands and held it firm. His other two arms wrapped around the Vortian's torso in a grip that even the predator's strength could not easily break. "Go," Torgan shouted to Lisa. "Help the bartender." I will hold this one. Lisa did not waste time with questions. She ran toward the main bar, where Danny was still fighting for his life against Crickstal. Other patrons watched Torgen's brave stand with a mixture of awe and shame. Here was a Grothian, a species not known for heroism, risking everything to protect a human he had never met. If he could find such courage, perhaps they could too. One of the Solari pilots moved to the control panel near the entrance and began working the emergency systems. Within seconds, heavy blast doors slammed down over every exit, sealing the bar completely. No more Vortians would be entering tonight. A small group of miners, rough beings from a dozen different worlds, grabbed whatever heavy objects they could find and formed a loose circle around Brex and Torgen. They were not fighters, but they were determined not to let the Grothian face the predator alone. Danny caught glimpses of this unexpected resistance between dodging Crickstal's attacks, and something warm flickered in his chest. These strangers were finding their courage because he had found his first. They were standing up because he had shown them it was possible. But the momentary distraction cost him dearly. Crickstal saw Danny's attention waver and seized the opportunity. One massive clawed hand swept around in an arc that Danny could not fully avoid. The razor-sharp edges caught him across the ribs, tearing through his shirt, and the flesh beneath pain exploded through Danny's body as blood began to flow from 3 deep gashes along his side. He staggered backward and nearly fell, catching himself on the edge of the bar counter at the last moment. "Ouch," Danny gasped, his voice tight with pain but somehow still carrying a note of dry humor. That actually hurt. Crickstal bared his teeth in triumph. First blood had been drawn, and soon the rest would follow. The human was weakening, and it was only a matter of time before he fell. "Now you see," the Vortian growled. "Now you understand what you face. Surrender the Talori, and I will make your death quick. Continue to resist, and I will make it last for hours." Danny pressed one hand against his bleeding side and straightened up slowly. His face was pale from blood loss, and his movements were not as smooth as before, but his eyes remained steady and unafraid. "I have had worse," he said simply, "and I'm still standing. Are you getting tired yet?" The taunt struck at Crickstal's pride. He had expected the wound to break the human spirit, but instead, it seemed to have only made him more determined. What kind of creature refused to give up even when facing certain death? Lisa arrived at Danny's side with a medical kit she had grabbed from behind the bar. She pressed a quick seal bandage against his wounds without asking permission and looked into his eyes with fierce determination. "You are insane," she told him. Completely and utterly insane. Danny managed a weak smile. "Probably," he admitted, "but I have been called worse. Can you keep pressure on this while I finish what I started?" Lisa nodded and held the bandage firmly in place. The bleeding slowed but did not stop completely, and she knew Danny did not have much time before the blood loss became critical across the room. Torgen and Brex were locked in a brutal wrestling match that had destroyed half the furniture. The Grothian's strength was impressive, but the Vortian's natural weapons gave him a significant advantage. Both combatants were bleeding now, and neither showed any sign of backing down. The circle of miners had grown larger as more patrons found their courage. They shouted encouragement to Torgen and threw objects at Brex whenever they saw an opening. It was not much, but it helped Danny survey the chaos around him and made a decision. He could not win a prolonged fight against Crickstal, not with his injuries, but he did not need to win. He only needed to end it behind the bar. Danny knew was a heavy cargo chain used to secure supply crates during transport. It was old and rusted, but it was strong, and it might be enough. "Lisa," Danny whispered, "when I move, I need you to get behind the bar and throw me the chain hanging on the back wall." "Can you do that?" Lisa glanced at the chain and nodded. "I can do that." Danny took a deep breath, ignored the fire in his side, and charged directly at Crystal with a roar that surprised everyone, including himself. The Vortian had expected the wounded human to play defensive, and the sudden aggression caught him off guard. Danny slammed into him at full speed, driving his shoulder into the predator's midsection and pushing him backward with pure human stubbornness. Crix tumbled over an overturned table and crashed to the floor with Danny on top of him. Claws scraped against human flesh, and teeth snapped inches from Danny's face. But he held on with desperate strength and refused to let go. "Now!" Danny shouted. Lisa vaulted over the bar, grabbed a heavy chain, and threw it with all her might. The rusted metal sailed through the air and landed within Danny's reach. Danny grabbed the chain and looped it around Krikstal's neck before the Vortian could react. He twisted the links tight and pulled with everything he had left, cutting off the predator's air supply. Krikstal thrashed and clawed, but Danny held firm. Blood soaked through his bandages, and his vision began to blur. But he did not let go. He could not let go. "Yield," Danny growled through gritted teeth. "Yield or die." The Vortian's struggles grew weaker as oxygen deprivation took its toll. His glowing eyes began to dim, and his movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Krikstal went limp. Danny released the chain and collapsed backward, gasping for breath and clutching his bleeding side. Every part of his body screamed in protest, but he was alive, and the predator was defeated across the room. Breck saw his leader fall and let out a howl of despair. His fighting spirit crumbled, and Torgen was able to throw him to the ground, where the miners quickly pinned him with their combined weight. The nebula drift fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the soft groans of the wounded. Everyone stared at the human who had done the impossible. Danny Kowalski had defeated a Vortian in single combat, and the galaxy would never be quite the same. The nebula drift looked like a battlefield. Tables lay broken and scattered across the floor. Glass crunched underfoot with every step, and the walls were marked with scratches and dents from the violent struggle that had just ended. Danny Kowalski sat slumped on a bar stool that had somehow survived the chaos, his face pale and his breathing shallow as Lisa Hartley worked frantically to patch his wounds. The 3 gashes across his ribs were deep and ugly, and blood had soaked through 2 layers of bandages already. "You need a real medical facility," Lisa said urgently. "These field patches are not going to hold forever." Danny shook his head weakly. "Later," he mumbled. "I have to deal with them first." He gestured toward Krikstal, who lay motionless on the floor with the chain still loosely wrapped around his neck. The Vortian was not dead, merely unconscious, but he would wake soon, and decisions needed to be made before that happened. Torgen the Grothian limped over to stand beside Danny, his gray skin marked with dozens of cuts and bruises from his battle with Brex. The second Vortian was still pinned under a pile of mires, too exhausted and demoralized to fight anymore. "What do we do with them?" Torgen asked in his rumbling voice. "Kill them and be done with it?" Several patrons nodded in agreement. Vortians were monsters who showed no mercy to their prey, so why should any mercy be shown to them? The galaxy would be better off with 2 fewer predators in it. Danny looked at the unconscious Vortian for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "We let them go." The declaration sparked immediate protest from nearly everyone in the bar. Voices rose in anger and disbelief, demanding to know why Danny would spare creatures that would have happily killed everyone. Present Danny held up a blood-stained hand for silence. "Listen to me," he said. "I know what you are thinking. I know they deserve death for what they do. But killing them would only bring more trouble down on the station." He paused to catch his breath, wincing at the pain in his side. "Vortians are pack hunters," Danny continued. "They travel in family groups and they take revenge seriously. If we kill these 2, their kin will come looking for answers. They will bring more hunters, and they will not stop until everyone on this station is dead or fled. The angry voices quieted as the patrons considered his words. None of them wanted to spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders for Vortian assassins. But if we let them go, Danny said, if we send them home alive but defeated, they will carry something worse than death. They will carry shame. In Vortian culture, being beaten by prey is the ultimate humiliation. Krikstal will never live this down, and his family will not risk the same fate by coming here for revenge. Lisa looked at Danny with new respect. Even wounded and exhausted, he was thinking strategically, considering the long-term consequences of every action. You have dealt with Vortians before. She realized Danny nodded slowly. Once, he admitted. A long time ago. I learned that sometimes the best victory is not the one that ends in death. Torgan considered the human's words and finally nodded his massive head. There is wisdom in what you say, the Grothian acknowledged. We will do it your way. The other patrons grumbled, but accepted the decision. Danny had earned the right to choose, and none of them were eager to argue with the man who had just defeated a Vortian in single combat on the floor. Krikstal began to stir. His orange eyes flickered open, and confusion gave way to memory as he realized what had happened. He had been beaten, choked into unconsciousness by a human, and the knowledge burned in his chest like swallowed fire. The Vortian rose slowly to his feet, and every being in the bar tensed for another fight. But Krikstal made no move to attack. He simply stood there, staring at Danny with an expression that mixed hatred with something that might have been grudging respect. You have won, Krikstal said, each word seeming to cost him physical pain. I acknowledge my defeat. Danny met the Predator's gaze without flinching. Take your partner and go, the human replied. Leave this station and never come back. The Talori's debt is cancelled, and you will tell anyone who asks that Way Station Sigma 7 is under my protection. The demand was outrageous, and everyone knew it. A single human claiming to protect an entire station from one of the galaxy's deadliest species should have been laughable. But no one was laughing. Krikstal's claws twitched with the urge to strike. But he controlled himself. The human had proven himself a worthy opponent, and Vortian honor demanded that such victories be respected. I will remember your name. Danny Kowalski, the Vortian said slowly, and I will make sure others remember it too. You have made a powerful enemy today, Danny shrugged, then immediately regretted it as pain flared through his wounds. I have had powerful enemies before, he replied. I am still here, and most of them are not. Make of that what you will. Krikstal stared at him for another long moment, then turned and hauled Brex to his feet. The two Vortians limped toward the main entrance, their pride wounded far more severely than their bodies. The blast doors rose to let them pass, and then they were gone into the corridors of the station. The nebula drift let out a collective breath of relief. It was over, truly over, and somehow they had all survived. Then the Talori emerged from his hiding place on shaking legs and approached, Danny with tears streaming down his furry face. The small merchant fell to his knees before the human and pressed his forehead to the floor in a gesture of absolute gratitude. You saved me, Ven whispered. You risked everything to save me, and I do not even know why. I am nobody. Just a small trader with nothing to offer. Why would you do this? Danny reached down and gently lifted the Talori to his feet, because it was the right thing to do, he said simply. And because no one else was going to. Ven stared at him with those huge, wet eyes. But the risk, the Talori protested. You could have died. You almost did die. How can protecting a stranger be worth your life? Danny thought about the question for a moment before answering. Where I come from, he said. We have a saying, the measure of a person is not how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who cannot. You could not help me. You could not fight beside me. You cannot offer me anything in return." "That is exactly why I had to help you." Lisa smiled at his words. She had grown up on Earth, and she knew the values Danny was talking about. Humans had spent thousands of years learning hard lessons about strength and weakness, about power and responsibility, about what it truly meant to be civilized. The door to the bar crashed open again, and everyone flinched before recognizing the figure rushing inside. It was Pete Callahan, an older human with gray hair and a mechanic's coveralls, who ran the repair dock 3 levels down. He was Danny's oldest friend on the station. "Danny!" Pete shouted as he pushed through the crowd. "I heard there was trouble. I came as fast as I could." "Are you—" He stopped dead when he saw the destruction around him and his friend sitting bloody and pale on a bar stool. "What in the name of everything holy happened here?" Danny managed a weak grin. "Redecorating," he said. "You know how I hate the old furniture." Pete looked at the shattered tables, the broken bottles, the terrified patrons, and the blood on the floor, then shook his head in disbelief. "One day," Pete said firmly, "one day you are going to tell me the whole story. But right now, we need to get you to medical before you bleed out on your own bar." Danny did not argue. The adrenaline was fading, and he could feel unconsciousness tugging at the edges of his vision. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was time to let others take care of him. As Pete and Lisa helped him toward the door, Danny paused and looked back at the gathered patrons. "Drinks around the house tonight," he announced. "Assuming anyone can find a glass that is not broken." Despite everything, a few beings actually laughed, and the sound filled the ruined bar with something warm and alive. Danny smiled as darkness finally claimed him, and his last thought before losing consciousness was that maybe, just maybe, he had chosen the right place to retire after all. 3 weeks passed after the night that changed everything at Waystation Sigma 7, and in that time, the Nebula Drift had been transformed. Danny Kowalski stood behind his newly repaired bar counter, surveying the work that had gone into rebuilding his establishment. The broken tables had been replaced, the shattered windows mended, and fresh bottles lined the shelves behind him. The place looked better than it had in years, thanks to the volunteer efforts of dozens of grateful patrons. His wounds had healed well, leaving 3 thin scars across his ribs that he wore without complaint. They were reminders of the night he had stood against a predator and refused to back down. The bar was busier now than it had ever been. Word of what had happened had spread throughout the station, and beings of every species came to see the human who had defeated abortion in single combat. They ordered drinks, asked questions, and stared at Danny with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright awe. Danny handled the attention with the same calm patience he applied to everything else. He answered questions when asked, downplayed his own role in the events, and quietly went about the business of being a bartender. He had never wanted to be a hero, and he was not about to start acting like one now. Lisa Hartley had decided to stay on the station. She had accepted a job at Pete Callahan's repair dock, using her engineering skills to fix ships and equipment for travelers passing through. Her apartment was just 2 levels above the bar, and she stopped in most evenings to share a drink and conversation with Danny. The friendship between them had grown strong in the weeks since that terrible night. They understood each other in ways that few others could, having faced death together and come out the other side. "I still think about it sometimes," Lisa admitted one evening as she sat at the bar. "The moment you handed me your beer and told me to hold it, I had no idea what you were planning, but something in your voice made me believe you could actually pull it off." Danny smiled and poured her another drink. "To be honest," he said, "I was not entirely sure myself. Plans are nice, but fights rarely follow them. You learn to adapt and hope for the best." Lisa shook her head in amazement. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Danny replied. "Not easy, but simple. You see someone who needs help, you help them. You see something wrong, you try to make it right. The hard part is not knowing what to do. It is finding the courage to actually do it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ven, the small tallery merchant whose life Danny had saved. Ven had become a regular fixture at the Nebula Drift, visiting whenever his trade routes brought him back to the station. "Danny, Lisa." Ven greeted them warmly, his large eyes bright with excitement. "I have news. Wonderful news that you must hear." Danny poured a drink for his small friend and waited for him to continue. "I have been traveling," Ven explained, "visiting worlds across 5 different systems, trading goods and sharing stories. And everywhere I go, I tell people about what happened here. I tell them about the human bartender who stood against a Vortian to protect the stranger." The Talori's voice grew animated as he continued. "And do you know what I have discovered?" Ven asked. "People are listening. They are really listening. The story is spreading from world to world, from ship to ship, from station to station. Beings who never thought twice about humans are suddenly seeing your species in a completely new light." Danny felt uncomfortable with this revelation. He had not fought Krikstal for fame or recognition, and the idea of becoming some kind of symbol made him uneasy. "It was just one fight," he said quietly, "against one Vortian. It does not mean anything in the bigger picture." Ven shook his furry head vigorously. "You are wrong," the Talori insisted. "It means everything. For so long, other species have dismissed humans as soft and weak, as beings who survived only because they avoided the attention of true predators. But now there is a story, a true story, that proves otherwise." He leaned forward with intensity in his large eyes. "They are calling it the legend of the Nebula Drift." Ven continued. "The tale of a human who handed his drink to a friend and said those 4 simple words before doing the impossible. And that phrase, 'hold my beer,' it has taken on a life of its own." Lisa laughed in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that beings across the galaxy are using it now," Ven explained excitedly. "Whenever someone is about to attempt something dangerous or improbable, they say, 'Hold my beer,' as a way of announcing their intentions. It has become a declaration of courage, a promise that something extraordinary is about to happen." Danny stared at the Talori in disbelief. He had spoken those words without thinking, using a phrase that humans had used for generations to signal reckless bravery. He never imagined it would spread beyond this bar. "That is ridiculous," Danny muttered. "That is wonderful," Lisa corrected him with a grin. "You have given the galaxy a new expression, and it is spreading human culture one drink at a time." Over the following months, Ven's reports proved accurate. The story of the Nebula Drift spread further than anyone could have predicted, carried by merchants and travelers to the farthest reaches of known space. Other species began to reconsider their opinions of humanity. These soft creatures from a harsh world called Earth were perhaps not as helpless as they appeared. If one retired bartender could stand against a Vortian, what might the rest of them be capable of? The phrase, "hold my beer," became a universal signal, spoken in ports and stations across the galaxy whenever someone was about to do something brave or foolish or both. Most beings had no idea where it came from, but they understood what it meant. And that was in Always Station Sigma 7, became a destination for those who wanted to see the place where the legend began. Curious travelers made special detours just to drink at the Nebula Drift and meet the human who had started it all. Danny accepted this new reality with his usual calm patience. He served drinks, told stories when asked, and treated every customer with the same quiet respect regardless of their species or status. Fame had not changed him, and he refused to let it one evening. As the bar hummed with its usual mix of music and conversation, the door opened to admit a young alien Danny had never seen before. The creature was thin and nervous, with large dark eyes that scanned the room with obvious wonder. The newcomer approached the bar slowly, as if walking on sacred ground, and stood before Danny with an expression of breathless anticipation. "Is this really the place?" The young alien asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Is this really the Nebula Drift, where a human defeated abortion with nothing but a barstool and courage?" Danny considered the question for a moment, then smiled and poured a drink. "Pull up a seat," he said warmly, sliding the glass across the counter. "And I will tell you a story." The young alien sat down eagerly, and several nearby patrons leaned in to listen. They had heard the tale before, some of them many times, but it never got old. Danny began to speak, his voice filling the bar with words that painted pictures of fear and courage, of monsters and heroes, of a night when one human had shown the galaxy what his species was truly made of, and somewhere out among the stars, in ports and stations and ships beyond counting, beings of every description were raising their glasses and speaking 4 simple words, the 4 doing something extraordinary: "Hold my beer." They did not always know why they said it, and most had never heard of Danny Kowalski, or the Nebula Drift, or the small Tollery merchant who had spread the story far and wide. But somewhere in their hearts, they understood what the phrase meant. It meant courage in the face of impossible odds. It meant standing up when everyone else sat down. It meant being human in the truest sense of the word, and in a small bar on a quiet station at the edge of known space. A retired bartender poured drinks and told stories and smiled at the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, he had made a difference after all. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, full of predators and monsters and things that would hunt the weak without mercy. But it was also a place where courage could inspire courage, where one act of defiance could echo across the stars, and where 4 simple words could become a legend. "Hold my beer," Danny whispered to himself as he wiped down the counter and prepared for another evening of work. And somewhere in the universe, someone heard him.